All right, welcome. I'm Michael Socklow, the director of the McGillicuddy Humanities Center at the University of Maine. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's event, the unveiling of the Hidden History Tour of the University of Maine. But before we get started, I'd like to mention three things actually. The first is that this event is being recorded. So by being here, you are consenting to the recording of it, and it will be placed on the center's YouTube page. All right, the second thing is I'd like to invite everyone to our year-end undergraduate fellows showcase on April 21st and 22nd in the evening. It's called The Stories We Tell, and it will feature our McGillicuddy Humanities Center Fellows, Karen Riordan, who will be speaking about What It Was and What I Know, Attempts at a Family History. Nola Prevost, All the Girls in the Woods, which is a feminist fairy tales for the modern world. Haley Sedor's presentation will be Local Involvement, Memory, and Denial, the Complexities of the Holocaust in Lithuania. And our fourth undergraduate fellow finishing up this spring is Nolan Altvater, and his project will be Wabanaki Tools of Diplomacy, Storying Protocols as Political Will. It'll be great events on April 21st and 22nd. Hope to see you there. And the third thing I'd like to do now is the official acknowledgement of the land. The University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce the three people who created the tour and will be speaking with us tonight. Since 2019, Karen Sieber has been the humanities specialist at the McGillicuddy Humanities Center. A specialist in digital history and the digital humanities, Sieber's worked in public history in North Carolina, Chicago, and elsewhere. As an historian, Karen consults on a variety of public-facing history projects nationwide, from museum exhibits to PBS programs. She serves as the Research and Outreach Coordinator for the Theodore Roosevelt Center and Digital Library, and her work has been featured or used as a resource by the American Historical Association, the Oral History Review, the Zinn Education Project, the History Channel, the Newberry Library, and other outlets. Often working in the digital humanities, the research tools that she's designed, including Visualizing the Red Summer about the 1919 violence, and The Well-Read President about Theodore Roosevelt, are used in over 300 classrooms nationwide. She's joined tonight by UMaine history undergraduate student and current McGillicuddy Humanities Fellow Elizabeth Dalton and future fellow Luke Miller, and together they'll be giving us the tour. If you have any questions as they speak, please drop them into the chat and we'll return to them during the Q&A. And with that, I turn it over to you, Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go through and kind of give you an overview of the tour, how it started, where we plan on going with it, and then you're going to get a sneak preview of the tour. You are officially our first audience. So Luke Miller is going to start us off here talking about kind of why we wanted to design this tour and what the purpose of it is.
Hi, everyone. The Hidden UMaine Tour aims to highlight key people, moments, and places in campus history that often go overlooked. In this way, this tour is a history of the USA through the lens of UMaine.
And Elizabeth is going to talk about the evolution of kind of where we started and where we're going.
So as some of you may not know, this entire project started as a class project for the History Department's 311 research seminar. The class is required for all juniors who are history majors within the department, and this past fall it was taught by Professor Riordan, who taught the class with a focus on public history. The discipline of public history requires all the same skills of any standard historian, but it requires us to use those skills in a non-traditional context, such as a public digital tour. So we put all our research together. We gave a final presentation to get a grade for a course, and we all vowed to pick the project back up at the beginning of this semester to put some fine little touches on it so that we could really feel comfortable about releasing it to the public. So with swapping from one digital map program to another, which is something Karen will touch on very soon, and with some fine tuning editing, we created a cohesive tour and exhibit, which you're all about to witness. So that's the evolution of the project.
So as Elizabeth said, they started with a program called Story Maps, which is something that I've used with students in the classroom before. It uses Google Sheets, Google spreadsheets, and so all you're doing is entering in names and dates and that kind of thing, and it maps it for you in this really beautiful format that you can see here on the upper right. But there are some reasons why it doesn't quite work for stories like this that are so interconnected and so tied to campus. You're really only able to feature a single image, a single resource, and just a short amount of text. And we really felt that these stories these stories involving such long periods of history and important themes within American history kind of deserved a little bit more breathing room. And we also wanted this to be something public that we could share with students and professors on campus, with alumni, community members. And so for that reason, after the students built their prototype, we've been moving everything over into this other program called Clio. The director or founder of Clio is in West Virginia, and I've met him over the years and have got to see this app kind of grow. So it started as just a really simple mapping program. It's now an app that you can download onto your phone, and there's classrooms across the country that are using it from K through 12 through college age, where each student will be assigned a different stop on a tour. And so I just like the usability of this. You're able to attach videos and audio files and numerous historic documents. You can link out to the sources where you got the information. But best of all is just the public facing factor that if someone goes to clio.com, there's 40,000 different historic entries. I call it the Yelp of history. So if you're looking for something to do next time you're on vacation, download the Clio app for your phone. There's great stories across the nation. But we thought that this would be a unique way, especially during COVID with social distancing, that people could take this tour in person by themselves, either at home on the computer or in person on campus, but outdoors, just with their phone. So this is something that is also expandable. So we can add audio tours, we can expand any of these stories, we can add additional stops, we can have multiple different tours. And so at the end, we'll talk about some different options for ways of extending this work. A few quick notes. As I mentioned earlier, this is our first run through. So please, pardon our dust, so to speak. We're still getting used to the text itself. Some of these stops are brand new. As anyone who has done local research realizes, the moment you dig into one story, you find two other potential stories. And so a lot of this is still coming together. Every time we finish the story, we think of some other angle that we want to explore further, some other collection or papers at Fogler that we want to dig into. So you will likely see us looking off the screen to read text or stumbling over our words a little bit. We welcome your feedback at the end because you are our first public audience. So with that, we're going to give you an introduction to the first 10 stops of this historic tour, but we do hope to expand on it in the future. So we have designed it in a way that all of the stops are clustered together with the exception of one lone stop. So this stop is designated on the app as only a virtual stop. So otherwise, all of the stops can be taken in person, and we designed them in a way that the stories are chronological and build off of each other. And so we're going to start at the start of the university's founding and work our way up through the 1970s and 80s and even a little bit into the present. So With that, Elizabeth is going to talk about the first women on campus.
All right, so female students were not initially admitted to the University of Maine, then known as Maine State College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts. But there was a law that was passed in 1872 that made colleges co-educational throughout the country, and the University of Maine was one of those that got caught under that law. And so with that, Louise Hammond Ramsdell of Atkinson, Maine, was admitted as the first female student at the University of Maine later that year after the law was passed. She was admitted with junior standing and graduated in 1874. And to follow her a few years later, Persia Vinal became the first female student to graduate with a graduate degree at the university. There was a lot more plight that the women had to deal with in order to go to school at the University of Maine in the early years of the college. It wasn't just a matter of overcoming, being allowed to attend the university. One of the biggest issues that female students faced was a lack of housing. So as it may be surprising for many to learn, female dorms did not exist for several years at the university. For the first 50 years of the university being open, there was no female dorms. In 1914, the first female dormitory was built and named after Elizabeth Abbott Ballantyne, the first female staff member at UMaine. And prior to that, female students had to live in chaperoned boarding houses or take a train from whichever town they lived in to get to their classes every day at the university. And some of these little trains and trolleys that they would take consisted of the Maine Central Railroad and the Bangor-Orono Old Town Electric Trolley. Nowadays, female students make up 51% of the student body. So this is a huge development for women, going from not even being able to live on campus and having to trek from wherever they were within the state to now female students making up the majority of the student population. Which leads us into female faculty members at the University of Maine. Early female faculty members accomplished many things despite any discrimination they may have come across. Carolyn Colvin, who we all may know of Colvin Hall on campus. She was the first female professor at the University of Maine. She was a professor in history, and she taught at the university from 1902 to 1932. Some of the accomplishments that she made while at the university was first and foremost being one of the first females within the country to be the department chair of a major university department. And she did that for about 2 decades. She also was Dean of Women at the University of Maine from 1923 to 1927, and successfully pushed for more housing on campus for female students, as well as pushing for women's suffrage. And I believe there are also ties to her being a part of the All Maine Women's Honor Society on campus. So Carolyn Colvin was a huge perpetuator of female student body and female rights within the university's early days on campus. She was not the only female professor, though. Another early female faculty member was Edith Patch. Edith Patch was known for being one of the revolutionary sort of female entomologists of her day, being recorded as one of the most successful female entomologists to this day within her field, and was elected as president of the Entomological Society of America in 1930. Edith Patch also had a series of children's books that sort of lit science up for young students who may be interested in her field of study. Her house is also not that far from campus and is in the National Register of Historic Places. Nowadays, women make up 47% of faculty at the university, which is a huge jump from only having 2 female professors in the very early days of the university.
And Elizabeth, before we move to the next slide, can you talk about when Edith was first hired?
Oh my goodness, yes. When Edith was first hired, it's very important to know that she was not offered any salary. She was brought on as a sort of, not even quite an assistant professor, but she was offered, I believe, the ability to not only study at the University of Maine as a student, but also do what was essentially like TA work that you would see today in a university classroom. And she essentially worked her way up from being this student level TA member of faculty to being a full-on salaried tenured professor. So she worked herself up from the very bottom and is now regarded as one of the most successful female entomologists in American history.
Yep, I'll note too that she was one of the first female environmentalists. So before Rachel Carson was even born, Edith Patch was out there preaching about the dangers of insecticides for the environment and all of these other things. So a woman early among her peers.
All right, so next we're going to talk about the history of Black students on campus and their success. One of the first known students of color at the University of Maine was Frederico W. Mathis, class of 1907. He went by Fred by his fellow students, and at a time when very few African Americans had access to higher education, Mathis broke barriers not just in the classroom but in sports as well. As you can see in the photo, he was a member of the UMaine football team at the time and actually was captain of one of the freshman teams. He was born in 1881 in Cape Verde. I can't pronounce that. Karen, can you pronounce that?
Cape Verde?
Yeah, Cape Verde, thank you. A Portuguese colony that was instrumental in slave trade. Slavery had only been outlawed there for 5 years before Fred's birth. Fred immigrated to the US as a young teen. Other family members who had arrived earlier were already well established in the Black community in Bangor. His father drove for the post office's mail team and his uncle was a popular fireman. After graduating from Bangor High School in 1903, he continued his education at UMaine. Mathis's inclusion on the football team is a very early example of integrated college sports. While a handful of earlier examples exist, many football teams in the South would not do so until 7 decades later. After graduating from UMaine in 1907, other records do suggest he graduated in 1908, but we think he was graduated in 1907 with a degree in civil engineering. Mathis worked as a railroad engineer in Bangor and later for the Bureau of Water in Philadelphia in a manager role. Students of color continued to prove themselves on campus in the decades that followed. For instance, Ada V. Peters was the first person of color to join Phi Beta Kappa at UMaine, one of the oldest and most prestigious academic honor societies in the country. Even in high school, she was at the top of her class with a nearly perfect average according to the Bangor Daily News article linked in the images you can see on your screen now. She was the daughter of Black Canadian immigrants, themselves descended from enslaved people who escaped to Nova Scotia, Canada, generations earlier and returned home following the Civil War. Ada graduated in 1927 from the University of Maine with a degree in French. By 1930, she was living in Alabama, teaching at Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. She later received her MA from Columbia University. Married to a prominent Black doctor, Jesse Jerome, J.J. Peters, the power couple was well known in both Tuskegee and New York circles. She continued to teach at Tuskegee for most of her life. Now Karen is going to tell us more about the Red Summer.
Yep, so not all stories of early African-American students on campus were pleasant and without confrontation. One cold night in April in 1919, the two brothers that are pictured here, Samuel and Edward Courtney from Boston, were attacked in their dorm room in the Hannibal Hamlin Hall by a group of about 100 students. They were able to escape, and there was a mob hunt to track down the brothers. And so this group of 100 grew to numerous hundreds, with different groups going out to Orono and Old Town and Bangor to find the brothers. They did end up finding them in Old Town. They put horse halters around the brothers' necks and led them 4 miles back to campus. Not back to the dorm room, but back to the livestock viewing pavilion. And the mob then lined the inside of what is now Cyrus Pavilion, lined the inside and watched the brothers as they were forced to take off their clothes and cover each other in hot molasses, and then they were covered with feathers. So this whole ordeal went on for numerous hours, from the initial attack to this event on campus, but the police only showed up after everything had wrapped up. This was kept out of the Bangor Daily News, out of the Maine campus, out of the Portland Press Herald. The only reason that records of this exist are because of the Black press. So places like the Chicago Defender, the most widely read Black paper at the time, this was well known to Black readers. It was just not really on local white readers' radar. And so I came across records of this actually at the Tuskegee Institute a couple of years ago, but put it on a flash drive that I lost. And so this is actually what kind of spurred the idea for this project was, well, if we don't know this one important moment of history, what are the other things that we don't know that happened on campus? So this was part of a larger series of events that happened nationwide that year, known as the Red Summer. And so the attack in Orono is one of dozens that happened in small towns and big cities, north, south, east, and west, across the nation that year. And a lot of this was kind of tied to this greater ideas of racism and nativism at the time. And so Elizabeth's going to talk a little bit about perhaps the most discussed building on campus, Little Hall.
Yes, so as Karen said, not all hidden histories are necessarily worth celebrating, but are definitely worth bringing into the limelight. Between 1913 and 1930, the university offered courses on eugenics and employed numerous leading scholars within the field. They were packaged as science courses to improve genetic quality of crops and whatnot, remembering that this was an agricultural school. However, as many of us know, the study of eugenics has led to many, for lack of a better term, uncouth justifications for specific racist thought processes. For instance, eugenics was often used to argue for the sterilization of specific members of society, such as Black people, Native Americans, immigrants, the poor, the disabled, mentally ill, and hundreds of people in Maine between the years 1925 and 1963 did fall subject to certain laws and sterilization that were perpetuated by thoughts and academic research that supported the theory of eugenics. A pretty big supporter of eugenics was former University of Maine president Clarence C. Little, which, as some of you may know, is the person in which Little Hall takes its name after. And then, as some of you may not know, there has been a pretty big petition to get Little Hall renamed because of this fact. Clarence Little is a bit of a controversial figure in the university's history. His presidency was described as stormy and a bit turbulent. He very much so openly promoted eugenics and euthanasia, and it played a huge role in his research. He helped found the American Birth Control League and served as the president of the American Eugenics Society. He spoke a lot about birth control at a birth control conference in 1925, where he compared the United States to a soda fountain using flavors like pineapple, strawberry, and chocolate to represent races. And he used eugenic theory to suggest that the blending of some of these races was perhaps would perhaps lead to negative impacts within society. Keeping in mind, on the other hand, while this is a fairly shocking thing to hear in our day and age, especially with a lot of what's been going on within the country, Little did help with society in many different ways as well. He was a notable founder of the Jackson Laboratory in Bar Harbor, where a lot of cancer research takes place. And as mentioned earlier with female student housing on campus, he did help Carolyn Colvin have Colvin Hall built for female students to live at. However, that doesn't really mitigate any of the horrendous things that he really pushed forward and believed in. And this controversy that Little brings in as a figure to the University of Maine is only further stressed by the fact that during his time as president, the Grand Dragon at the university, at the Grand Dragon of the Maine sect of the KKK in the 1920s was DeForest Perkins, a UMaine graduate from the class of 1900. He was a varsity football player. He was the sophomore class president. He was a fairly notable figure and student of his time at the University of Maine. And the fact that his legacy goes on to being a leader of the Maine sect of the KKK only further stresses, the fact that, the theory of eugenics that the KKK did believe in really only stresses the negativity that surrounds the legacy of Clarence C. Little.
I'm going to mention one more thing about DeForest Perkins. He was actually the head of the Portland school system. And so he was the one making the decisions and in power about what kind of education immigrants were getting and African-American students were getting, that it wasn't just, his power was not just within the KKK, but he was very much a public figure within education. So I'm going to talk about a brand new story that over the weekend I was filling in some holes related to the Great Depression, and we were talking about the GI Bill. And I was looking into university housing within the Great Depression era. We had a short piece on financial aid that Elizabeth was working on. But in doing so, I discovered a layered story that kind of starts pre-Depression and goes through the 80s. And you are all familiar likely with this lot, whether you know what happened there or not. So we're talking about the space that if you're heading north onto campus up Rangeley Road, it's this northwest lot here. So it's across from that ballpark as you're going down Park. So I just want to orient everyone here. This place has gone from a Depression era Hungry Hollow to bum stock. So back in the day, 1913 or so, there was a farmer that lived on that land. His name was Ernest Littlefield. Everybody called him Gramps. He let poor students live on his property starting in the teens. The first two students to live there were Ernest Hamilton and Henry Covell. He converted an old hen house for them. Throughout the years, numerous other cabins popped up. I'm using the term cabin loosely. The records that I can find, they seem to be kind of ramshackle, like barely camps even, definitely not year-round properties. So within a few years, there's a dozen. It quickly becomes known as Hungry Hollow, that this is kind of the place where poor people live. Over the years, more than 500 students lived there on the Littlefields farm in these various small properties. But when the Great Depression hit, they really saw an increase of the amount of people that were setting up on the property. So there was people driving in trucks that had like makeshift campers on the back. There was tents, there was people in cars. And this was not the only location locally suffering. So there was another kind of Hooverville-esque settlement that was north along Stillwater River. So when the Great Depression hit, people couldn't think about paying their bills or feeding their families, let alone a luxury like college. But there was still students that, despite all of this, wanted to find a way to still receive their education. And so Maine, like many states, took a portion of FDR's Federal Emergency Relief Act of 1933, known as FERA, and that was distributed to states for them to spend individually on their workforces, similar to COVID funds that were recently distributed. Every state kind of had a say. So 16% of the US population ended up getting a portion of these funds. So that's half of the unemployed people at the time. In 1934, there was 142 students on campus that took advantage of these FERA funds. So that helped a little bit, but housing is still a concern with any student struggling financially. The university kind of felt that they had to do something about this Hooverville community that was popping up on the farm. So they ended up taking over the property, raising all of the original cabins, and they built some really beautiful government-funded kind of WPA cabins, almost like CCC cabins, very crude, but uniform lines of them. And they were 22 by 30 foot structures. They rented for $1.50 a week, and they held 4 students, bunk beds, table, wood stove. That was it. So these were unique in the fact that they were quite a deal away from campus. They were surrounded in the woods. Many of the students kept livestock. They were required to do all of their own cooking and cleaning. This was very much kind of an experiment. And it went well for a while. After the war, there was the war boom. A lot of students taking advantage of the GI Bill. They were still fairly brand new at the time. But by the time we hit the 60s, it's kind of overrun by hippies and burnouts, and it has this bad reputation again. And it very much has this outsider spirit. So this original spirit that existed back when it was Hungry Hollow has somehow shown up again by the 60s and 70s. There used to be a little grocery store carry out kind of as part of the cabin community. That became a coffee shop where you would go hear poetry readings in the 60s. Stephen King lived in one of these cabins during his time at UMaine. But at least for the first 10, 15 years, a little bit longer even, no females were allowed to live in the cabins. So these were men out in the middle of the woods, cooking and cleaning and doing their own bedding. But eventually, as more married couples moved in, you would see a few females showing up on the property. So the university, again, is like, well, what do we do about all of these hippies? If you are familiar with Bumstock, the festival that was inspired by Woodstock, the very original location of it was here at the university cabins in 1973. So by the time 1980 came around, the university decides again that they want to take over Bumstock, they want to move it back to campus, they want to organize it, they want wristbands, they want ID checks, and to be able to move it away so it wasn't so much of an eyesore, because it really was something that you could see from Park Avenue And every time someone drove by campus, it was kind of like a reminder of this community was not really well regulated. There was no one to really hold people accountable. And so it was just kind of like Wild West down there is how it was described. So in 82, the university took away the few remaining cabins that were salvageable and razed the rest of the property. And now it's been an abandoned dirt lot for nearly 40 years now. So next time you go by that intersection, if you are not familiar with Bumstock, I do hope that you do an internet deep dive on the Clio app. We do provide some links, and so I put a link to videos of people performing at Bumstock on YouTube, and a link of a home video from the very last Bumstock in 1981. And then there's also some images from Bumstock from throughout the years. So this was kind of a fun recent discovery. Oh, I did not go far enough in my photos here. So these are photos from the last Bumstock located on the cabin properties. It did have a resurgence through the years. There was fairly regularly a Bumstock throughout the 80s and 90s, early 2000s even, but there would, it would start and stop. It would move locations. For a while it was indoors. Our budget analyst at the McGillicuddy Humanities Center actually played at Bumstock back in, I think, 97, I believe, 98 maybe. So you can see here that the trailers pulling away the cabins, but you can see just piles of rubble all around of what remained there. So Luke is going to pop back into time. As I said, this story initially started as a Great Depression story, and so World War II would be next. But as it turns out, the last location had quite a long history.
All right, so we did research on the class of 1944, with trying to find out more of the school's history and involvement in World War II. From the earliest days on campus, students have been involved in the military, including students who were part of the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the First World War. Through this research, we found one student, Stephen L. Jacobs, who came to the University of Maine, and as a member of the class of 1944, he was a member of the class of 1944. Sorry, I lost my place. In 1943, student enrollment dropped by roughly 40% as most male students enlisted in the military. Jacobs, who had served in the ROTC program during the build-up to World War II, put his education on pause to answer the call of duty, leaving his new wife, Isabel Ansel, behind. He served in the Pacific Theater from June 7th, 1943 to March 30th, 1946. While he was in service, he was awarded a Purple Heart for being wounded by tank fire and a Bronze Star for heroic service. That Bronze Star was earned by leading the platoon he was in charge of in an important mission to help take a city in the Philippines. After the war, he returned to UMaine to finish his education, taking advantage of the GI Bill assistance towards tuition and living expenses. Efforts like the FERA and larger work progress admissions initiatives mentioned in the previous tour stop by Karen paved the way for later government assistance programs like the GI Bill. By 1956, nearly 8 million veterans used the benefit to attend college or universities, and more than 5 million for other vocational training programs. When Jacobs graduated in 1947 with a bachelor's degree in forestry, he pioneered Maine's first high school course in forestry at Gould Academy in Bethel, Maine. Jacobs earned a master's degree from UMaine in 1963 and went on to teach physics and chemistry at Dexter Regional High School for 17 years. Later in his life, as a tribute to his fellow UMaine students who he served with, he created a history of the class of 1944, which was our initial major source for this topic. Despite the likely difficulty in recalling traumatic memories of the war, Jacobs went to great lengths to recognize his classmates' heroism. He collected stories and service records about his fellow students in service, both those who returned and those fallen who never had a chance to come home. In total, 69 UMaine alumni lost their lives in the war. Their stories will live on in Fogler Library special collections thanks to Jacobs' dedication. We hope to expand this section to include the women from the UMaine community who helped with the war effort. We can go to the next slide, Karen. This next stop is about student activism on campus. While many UMaine students over the years, like those in the class of 1944, chose to serve their country, there have always been those in opposition to war. This is especially true during the Vietnam War. While students nationwide filled university green spaces and administration buildings to protest the war, here at UMaine, student Kenneth Contrell organized a local chapter of Students for Democratic Society in 1965. This was the only chapter in Maine. Elsewhere across the country, chapters focused largely on civil rights issues, but initial efforts in Orono were centered around the Vietnam War and the draft. In May of 1969, members of the SDS and a few faculty members held a protest against US policies in Vietnam. Over 300 counter-protesters threw eggs at the roughly 50 demonstrators and destroyed banners. Other student organizations rallied for women's rights, abortion rights, peace, the environment, and other causes. Protests and student activism were not limited to the 1960s, though. In 1985, students from UMaine and at campuses across the country set up makeshift shanty towns to draw attention to apartheid in South Africa. This peaceful protest was led by the Maine Peace Action Committee, which is still active locally. We hope to expand this topic going forward and then into more present day stuff as well. Next, we have Elizabeth talking about LGBTQ students.
All right, so inclusivity is something that is a lot more commonplace today. We have LGBTQ events such as like Pride Week, Gay Thanksgiving, Lavender Prom, but this openness on campus did not always exist. It especially did not exist up until the first openly gay club was founded at the university in 1974. This club is the Wildstein Club. It is founded by notable alumni, Sturgis Haskins, Stephen Bull, and John Frank. The group very successfully petitioned and founded the club with university sanction. They were not just a organization that they advertised amongst peers and whatnot. They had university backing. And as you can imagine, this might have caused a lot of uproar in the community at the time, considering gay rights and LGBTQ plus peoples were not very much accepted within society. So one of the notable things that the club pursued was an annual Maine Gay Symposium. And the first one took place in 1974 after the founding of the group. It was sort of their first open public event that really caught them a lot of attention in the community. There was a lot of pushback. There was a huge effort to protect the identities of students and members that were attending the group. And the symposium had a requirement that no media outlet cover the event or use photographs, names of anybody, because they did want to protect those who felt open enough to join the group. There was which is a very understandable concern at the time. When you juxtapose this with what was going on with the Stonewall riots and a lot of the gay civil rights movements that had already been occurring in 1969, this is a huge step historically for the university to allow a group, an openly gay group, meet either weekly or every few weeks. And a lot was done to protect the students who were brave enough to get involved. Students today seeking an inclusive community can always seek out the Memorial Union on campus, where we actually have resources now for the LGBTQ plus community, and they don't have to necessarily hide away in fear that they could be attacked or met with violence. So this is an incredible step in the university's history.
Thank you. And the final step on the tour is the Wabanaki Center, which is located in Corbett Hall. So visitors now have probably noticed all of the new signage across campus in the Penobscot language. So this particular sign actually of Corbett Hall, you'll see underneath here in Penobscot, it is in the Dawnland, which is the Penobscot name for Maine, for their homeland. So we lately have been doing a much better job of acknowledging this history on campus, but what we sometimes do a poor job of acknowledging is the more recent history of Penobscot peoples on campus and their active involvement with different moments and milestones. So while the signs are important, we would like to tell you today about some of the earliest Penobscot students on campus, as well as faculty members, and the great work that they did to kind of further Native American education in the state. So one of the very first, the first known Penobscot people to graduate from the University of Maine was Eunice Nelson. She graduated in 1939. She grew up on Indian Island. She went on from UMaine. She got her master's and her PhD from NYU. She was a very noted anthropologist in her field. She wrote a lot on the Wabanaki history and Wabanaki people. She was also the head librarian at the Museum of the American Indian in New York City. So she was very much a sought after scholar in her field. After doing all of this, and she taught at a number of top universities and museums, she came back home to teach at UMaine. And so that is where she ended up her career. On the right here is someone that actually started at almost the same time as Eunice Nelson. Dr. Theodore N. Mitchell, who goes by Ted. He started also in 1938, so a year before Eunice, and very well might have been the first person to graduate, but he ended up dropping out like many because he was starting a family. And quickly his family grew to 14 children. But throughout that time period, despite the fact that he was working construction jobs on campus, helping build Memorial Gym and build Hilltop and all of these other places, he was taking a class here and there at night, on the weekends, whenever he could fit it in to make sure that he finished his education. So he did that for quite a long time, continued on after undergrad, got his graduate degree at UMaine. He ended up becoming a guidance counselor, first at Indian Island School, which is notable because he was the first non-white person to work in some kind of academic or advisory role at the school. It had previously always been priests and nuns. So to be a Native American student at the school and to have an advisor who actually understood you, I think is just such a big notable thing, even if it is just such a local story. He then went on in a very similar role at the university. He was an advisor. He started in 1974 at 52 years old. He was hired as an advisor for UMaine's Onward program, which assists adult students like him going back to school, juggling family and work and school work. He continued on as the Associate Dean of Minority Student Affairs, and in that role, he fought for many years for the creation of the Native American Studies program, the tuition waiver program, the opening of the Wabanaki Center. So there's quite a lot of what we know now to be this really great, strong Native American Studies program, and all of these things that are seen as models for other universities wanting to, expand their tuition waivers or start a center on campus. That much of this is due to the work of Dr. Mitchell. But as I said, Eunice is the first person we know of. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is, race is such a tricky thing that for years, the university had identified, for instance, the first African-American student to be someone in like the late 20s or early 30s. But we have Luke's story here of Federico Mateus, who's from 1908. You've come across other stories of people far before then. So, race is not something that is easily identifiable by someone's photo, by someone's name, by someone's location, that it is such a complex, layered thing. And so we're working to identify people even before this. But as of now, I think Dr. Eunice Nelson is a perfect person to be considered the first Wabanaki student, because she really just went on to do such wonderful things in her field. If you have not looked over her Wabanaki bibliography, she was the first one to kind of put together all of the resources that existed out there. So these are the 10 stories that we have started with, and we'll show you a little bit of a demonstration of what this looks like if you are taking the tour in person, and then we'll give you a little preview of some other stories that we're wanting to dig into in the future. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, good. So Luke is going to walk through this, and I'm going to try to run the mouse.
All right, so this is Clio. Guys, it's theclio.com. The easiest way to find our tour is by either searching the title, which is Hidden Histories at UMaine, or you can search by location and just type in Orono. Type in Hidden History, for example, you get the search page, and then give the internet some time, and there's our tour right there. Here you can see kind of the landing page for the tour itself. This has all of our stops on the right. It has our map that you can see where those stops are. And it has other general information like an intro to the entire tour itself at the top. Let's show you what one of our stops looks like. We'll go through the student activism on campus stop. With this, you can see that there's text-to-speech audio, which allows people while they're walking on the tour to hear what our content is.
Before jumping into the backstory of student activists on campus, please read the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that are placed around this plaza named in his honor.
As you heard in that little clip, and as you can see, if the map was slightly more detailed, this stop is located at the MLK Plaza on campus between Stevens Hall and the Student Union, which is emblematic of how activism is on campus as well as nationwide. You can also see that we have images of articles from this particular event, and you can see that we can also add images here for other things like people involved or the place where the event took place itself. As well, on the bottom of Clio, which is one of the reasons we liked it the most of our options, was because we were able to add sources on every single stop, which allows people who are interested in the tour or want to learn more a place to go next if they enjoy the topic. So, unless you want to add anything else, Karen, I think that's pretty good.
No, that's pretty good. So yeah, please do. You know, we've kind of shared the highlights or a couple of our favorite photos. But within some of the stops, there's 10 or 12 or 15 photos and newspaper articles and other things uploaded. So please do go in there and peek around, as well as those videos of bum stock and other things. Whoops, sorry. There we go. Was this Luke, you or me?
Were we supposed to talk about the Instagram page next?
No,
Will be.
I think this is you, Karen, and on the next slide.
No problem. So this existing tour, the 10 stops that we currently have, there's a few things that we would like to expand upon. This is kind of our prototype. So, you know, as Luke said, there are some additional civil rights stories that we would like to include in that MLK Plaza stop, as well as the role of women during World War II. As I mentioned, we think that there are likely earlier Black and Wabanaki students. Added citations throughout. You know, as I said, it's a rabbit hole. Every time we look for one new fact and detail, we find, you know, 10 new articles that really just add whole new layers and dimensions to the stories. We played that little bit of an audio clip for you, which is the automated audio tour, the computerized audio tour. We do have the option of recording the stops ourselves and having an actual human voice attached to the tour. So that is an expansion that we would like to have in the future. And then I think for those people that are unfamiliar with the university or maybe not taking the tour in person, to have images of some of these buildings, even though the story is about the person and the experience and that moment in history, these stories are still attached to physical spaces. And so I think having, you know, what does a photo of what does Little Hall look like? What does Colvin Hall look like? Clio does have the fabulous opportunity to do Google Street View, but somewhere like a campus, Google Street View is not really available for every single building. It's available for a handful. And so we have it turned off for some of the stops, but that would, I think, provide some context. But there's added extra stories that we would love to dig into as well that aren't even part of these original stories.
Right, so like Karen just said, there's a lot of different directions this project can go in terms of campus history. Many of you might have seen in the Student Union, there's a small exhibit on the mascot outfits for Bananas, the school mascot. But then we can go back even further, and there used to actually be a black bear where, you know, that you can see a picture of right now, that we'd like to learn more about. And there's a number of other things in this list that we have varying levels of understanding already, but all increasing levels of interest we want to dive into in the future.
Which leads us to the Instagram page that I mentioned earlier. It speaks a little bit for itself. There's not too much to explain. Really, all I do is I take some of the little hidden histories that we found, create a little teaser post to sort of get people to engage with the content, perhaps in a way that isn't solely based off of the digital tour. And it's all done to kind of encourage people to not only encourage mostly students to get engaged with the history of the university, but also to kind of reach out and see if people will kind of take advantage of a tour that gets them outside in a day and age where we're all stuck inside and engaging with the history they're surrounded with. There's not too much to say about it, but if you'd like to follow, I'd love to have people engage with the content and leave comments and all sorts of stuff.
Well, I think that's probably a good spot to stop for questions.
Tim Garrity has a question in the chat. The university's land acknowledgement recognizes that it's located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation. Is there something unique about the history and status of Marsh Island that makes its Penobscot connection stronger than many other places in Maine?
That's a good question that I don't know if I necessarily have the answer for. The university is unique in that it is a land grant university. So at the time, because of the Morrill Act of 1864, is it 4 or 5? That other universities nationwide were land grant universities. The land for the university was specifically taken from Native American peoples. That's not as much the case here on campus. The land generations earlier, over a series of bad treaties and secessions, land had already been kind of incrementally taken away. So our connection to the Morrill Act and to land grant universities is a little different on campus. So there's not an immediately local history, and it doesn't have, to my knowledge, as much of a significance as the Old Town and Indian Island area, just a little bit up the river. But really the Penobscot land, because we're talking about 5 different nations here within Wabanaki land, that there's 5 different nations within kind of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And so even just the Penobscot peoples, the range of their land is really the vast majority of what we now, call Maine. Even really much of the land was taken away almost more on the recent side than on the farther away side. So, all of the land is sacred, and all of the land is technically Penobscot land. It's just not as immediate of a history beneath the campus land.
And I'll note, but we have people who might be more expert on this here in the meeting. Like I think Libby Bischoff might know this better than I do. She does probably. And Tim, you might know the 1980 Maine Land Claims Settlement Act and the issue of the inland islands, the islands that are sit in the rivers, and what they meant going back to the original treaties. Because the thing that I had heard was that Marsh Island. Was that there was a controversy over Marsh Island being where the university is because they renamed the Stillwater River in order to prove that Marsh Island is not, in fact, an island in the Penobscot River, that the Stillwater River is truly a branch of the Penobscot.
Interesting.
And that if the Penobscot River surrounded Marsh Island, the University of Maine and the original title to the campus would never have been allowed. But by renaming, Tim, can you?
I can't help you on that. I really ask because I don't know. And I don't want to send us down a rabbit hole, but I was just wondering if perhaps this might be a topic for a future hidden history. I've been curious as I've heard this acknowledgement before, and I was kind of guessing a little bit at where Karen was going with this. Was there something about the 1865 Morrill Act that took land away from the Penobscot Nation to give it to the university, and that's why it's mentioned in this manner, that it's located on Marsh Island? Here's Libby pitching in to help us out with this. We could go right to, she's given us the source right there.
Great. Can you help us out with this? Do you know the story of?
A little bit. I mean, to the extent that, and I'll drop another, we have this great map in our bicentennial exhibit that just went down. That's actually an early survey sketch of Orono around 1818 that James Francis wrote a commentary on. And the commentary that the Penobscot tribal historian, James Francis, and he wrote extensively about the Stillwater River and the way in which that is the true kind of passageway and right of way because of how much more navigable it was. And so that's a significant part of that. And it also shows the island. So you can also see the ways in which these early surveyors just before Maine statehood are carving up access to that part of the river and selling it off as lots. And that takes away portage rights.
and access to the most navigable parts of the river. So I will drop that in the chat as well, but I don't want to take away from the great presentation that you all did, and it was really great. As a public historian, it's really nice to see what other people are doing, and I'm teaching history of Portland in the fall at USM, and we're going to be diving into our campus, so it was really neat to see what you've been doing.
Well, and this is something, you know, we showed the story maps exhibit, and we very well might take all of the same information and also put it back into story maps, or because the stories are somewhat chronological, for those that are unfamiliar with Timeline JS, that would be another way of kind of showing this information visually, to kind of better see the connectivity of all of these different stories. But again, I like the Clio because it has the space to add the full story, to go back in and repeatedly add more details, more photos, more captions. And I like the idea that it might lead to other discoveries. So someone looking for our tour might come across a tour of Dorothea Dix Hospital or somewhere in Ellsworth, or, you know, it might send them on some other little road trip and tour excursion. But as I said, we're hoping to expand all of these stories. So I would definitely like, I've only been in Maine for 2 years, so my Native American history is Cherokee and Potawatomi, which do me absolutely no good here. So so this is a story, I think, especially this story and the civil rights story, we're really wanting to kind of expand and make as detailed as possible to give the best representation of you know, what actually happened at the time. There are the land grant universities that I mentioned. There's a really great website out there called Land Grab You, that looks at some other universities nationwide, particularly in the West, that were more directly and immediately affected by the Morrill Act. So if you have not played around with that website, you really should. They do give some figures for Maine as far as how much the state government has made off of that land and off of endowments and that kind of thing over the years. So there are some really interesting figures of still the way in which this originally native land has been kind of manipulated for greater profit. So any other questions about any of the other stops or plans for expansion? I mean, I see a lot of other classroom possibilities here. So we would love to do a collaboration with someone like in the Department of Agriculture to look at all of that great agricultural history across campus. We have all of these wonderful photos of like cows in front of Fogler Library and students walking past chicken coops to class. Or I was talking with Elizabeth and Luke about the fact that I think a lot of students walk right by Page Farm and don't even really think twice about the fact that there's a farm smack dab in the middle of campus. So, you know, our point in doing this was not exactly necessarily the exact places, or even for that matter, the exact people. The biggest point of doing this is to get people to stop and think as they're walking around campus about those that came before them, about how things have changed and progressed, about how campus history really aligns with US history. We were talking just before everybody joined that, you know, this is something that is so specific to Orono and to Maine, yet I could slap a completely different title on this PowerPoint, University of Michigan, and we could tell a lot of these same stories. They have their own little hall. I'm sure that they have their own version of Bumstock. I'm sure that the experiences of the first female faculty members were quite similar to Edith Patch and Carolyn Colvin. So these stories are, you know, they're both local, but they're so universal, not just the big national stories, but really, as I said, just the way that all campuses really have this ability to use public history as a tool to better understand US history. So Jacob has a question about secret societies. So I have seen brief mention. I can't say they were super secret. They were somewhat a little bit well known. It's not a story that we have dug into a whole lot yet, but I think that seems like the perfect type of story that we would like to dig into further. Fogler's collections are really wonderful. So we have all of the past issues of the Maine campus, of the yearbook. And so really if stories do exist out there, I'm sure that that we would like to look into that. There are a lot of collections related to other societies, but more so like fraternal organizations and, you know, Odd Fellows and Woodmans of the World and that kind of thing. I think there's some Mason files at Fogler. Libby says this is a great way to experience building out digital interfaces for public use. I agree. You know, I always tell the students that everything is data, like everything can be made into a spreadsheet. So it may look like a Clio map, but ultimately it's a title and a description and a geotagged location. And so really there's all of these great tools like Clio out there, but the story maps.js and the timeline.js and Omeka that are really user-friendly and free to use and quick to learn. And so I think, you know, they're not just great for classroom use, but for museums and historical societies, that any cash-strapped organization, this is one of the easiest ways to kind of take the information you already have and turn it into something usable and public-facing. Otherwise, we're just talking to each other as academics, you know, so if we can, you know, inform past alumni or current students on campus to give them a more comprehensive understanding of campus history, then, you know, I think our job is done. Especially now in a digital world, it's so great to be able to do this at, you know, at the touch of a finger. So people living far away wanting to reminisce about campus history, or students wanting to get out of their dorm and experience the tour in person. We do hope maybe in the fall to do an actual in-person live tour. And we'll have some of the stories kind of worked out by then a little bit more, and we'll have our speech down. So I think that'll be a great way once weather is nicer and things are safer to get out in public. We had played around with some ideas of doing some physical markers in the location. So maybe a little wooden stake with just a little cardboard cutout on the top that has like a number and hidden history and, you know, a QR code or a link to the website or the Instagram page. But something that would also, even if people were unfamiliar with the Clio app, unfamiliar with the Hidden History Tour, walking around campus might stumble upon this other marker and say, ooh, I want to look into that a little bit more. So we're hoping that this sparks some curiosity. Well, that seems like maybe a good point to end. If any of you are interested in starting similar projects, please do reach out and let me know, whether that's classroom collaborations or public facing. As I said, it's quite easy to learn. If you have ideas for other hidden histories, or if you're interested in helping us expand any of these stories, please do let us know.
Wait, just one last quick thing, Luke and Elizabeth, you've been asked to reflect on the experience. Could you close out the event with your reflections on doing this and you're thinking about public history as a future?
This has been a pretty interesting experience for me just because I plan on going through UMaine's 4+1 master program for history. I've already gone through the preliminary sort of workup for that, and I have more to do next fall. But I'm planning on getting my master's, probably taking a little bit of time off to get some experience, but then going back to school for a PhD in museum studies. So public history is kind of the outlet I was already sort of planning to go with my degree in history. I just didn't realize that it was public history. So going through Professor Riordan's class and working on this project has actually taught me a lot about how to label the kind of work that I've always been trying to do from the get-go. And it's given me just a lot of skills to sort of set myself up for a nice start and entrance into public history as a historian.
And for me, I plan to go into law after school. So this hasn't so much as changed what I'm thinking of doing in the future, but it has allowed me to get a stronger perspective for, where I come from as a student and as an academic, which I appreciate. I think it's created a stronger sense of what it means to be a Black bear. We're not just this school in the snow in the middle of nowhere, although that's what I got on the tour when I started school here. While we are still that, we're much more. And it's great that, we can unpack these stories and we're able to share them with so many people. Good question.
Speak for a moment about the current research. Well, Elizabeth, the current research you are doing, and Luke, the research you plan on doing next fall for your fellowships with us.
I can go first. So I'm currently working on a research project as a fellow at the McGillicuddy Humanities Center. I still don't really have a good title for my project that's short and catchy, but I'm essentially looking at modern film portrayals of medieval history and sort of highlighting where they really exaggerate stories for the sake of show and warp history for entertainment. And my plan is to actually take that knowledge and sort of display the historical inaccuracies found in film on TikTok and sort of spread that knowledge in a way that kind of gets a younger crowd to engage with history, which is something I'm actually very passionate about. And that's kind of just the rough little sort of preliminary details about my project.
Cool. And Luke, you just got your award letter today. So this is brand new news to you, but you've been working on this proposal. We started working on it last year. You decided last year was not the year. I'm going to do it my senior year. So what are you planning? How has it evolved over the past year?
Yeah, so originally I wanted to study how, I wanted to go the numbers route of how public policy affects the amount of people who are affected by homelessness every year in the United States. And I was planning to go from World War II up through the Gulf War. That was my original plan. Since then, I've skewed it and I'm going more of, and I think this is the better project, the more important project, is I want to look at how public policy, both state and local level, affects the homeless population as a community. So whether that's, if it makes it more difficult for those people, whether it makes things easier, how it makes everyday life change through public policy. And I hope at the end of this, I can create essentially a public memo that can be used by nonprofit groups and politicians to help advocate for the homeless community.
And this is specific to Maine, correct?
Yeah, and so I'm interested in doing this as part of my eventual career nationwide, which is why this is so exciting, because it's kind of like I get to jump into what I think my future will be. But also I'm using Bangor specifically, with also some interest in Augusta and Portland, because those are also centers of homelessness in the state, being big urban areas in comparison to the rest of Maine. And so I'm using Bangor specifically as like my focal point to understand how those policies affect the homeless community.
Excellent. I see Rebecca made a comment here about student research. Rebecca or others listening, I don't know what year you are, but we have 2 cycles annually where we accept new undergraduate fellows. So you have to be in your junior or senior year during the fellowship. So there will be another application cycle in October to be a fellow in spring and fall of 2022. Am I thinking about that right? And so if you have kind of an idea that you've been stewing on, that you've been thinking about, maybe a project that you started with a class, it does not have to look like traditional research. It can be a conference paper, but as Elizabeth said, it can be a TikTok series. We have people doing poetry readings, creating websites, chat books. So there's, really the opportunities are endless. We just want to see you kind of create something that's entirely yours and make it your own, and dig into something that's meaningful to you. That's kind of, we want to know that you're passionate about what you're researching, that you kind of have an idea of what you would like to dig into. So there's more information on our website, but the fellowship is really a great opportunity. It provides you with $8,000 in funding over the course of an academic year, as well as just the ability to work with a cohort of other students who are kind of equally passionate about what they're doing. And even though everyone is doing research on their own individual projects, there's always alignment. Michael mentioned at the beginning our fellows who are finishing up. So this year's alignment is that they're all kind of looking into stories that we tell each other and how those stories change and differ, like Elizabeth's research of how actual medieval history warps into the entertainment version of medieval history. So for other events coming up, please do check out our website at umaine.edu/MHC or find us on social media. Thank you so much for joining tonight, and please do stay in touch.
Yes, thank you.
Elizabeth and Luke, really, for all of your hard work.
Thank you.